So this video has been overdue for a very long time. I did my Final Fantasy tier list video not that long ago. It took me a while to really talk about this game, and I think the reason why it took me a while to talk about Final Fantasy 16 is because after my first initial playthrough, I didn't know how I felt about it. It didn't occur to me until around the time Final Fantasy 16 released that maybe I should go into these games blind. In fact, when I look at a lot of my favorite games growing up as a kid, I had no idea if they were going to be good or not. I had no idea about trailers or anything because the internet wasn't as big back then, right? Like I grew up Nintendo 64, GameCube era video games. So for me, I didn't have trailers to look at. So I went into these games and I had no idea what to expect, and I would always come out like pleasantly surprised or just with no expectations going in. So for me, the thing that made 16 so unique was that because I went into it blind, I had no expectations. The only thing I knew is that since Final Fantasy X, Final Fantasy never really felt the same to me. But that doesn't mean bad, right? But there was always something missing around the series. So I knew going into 16 that I wasn't going to get that fuzzy feeling I went back when I played Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9 for the first time, right? But I'm always giving Final Fantasy a chance. It comes to the point where I play the game, I go through it, I'm really enjoying the first half of the game, and then the second half doesn't disappoint me entirely, but it leaves me very puzzled because the first half was so fucking good. So it took me a year to replay the game and really solidify my opinion on it. And to be honest with you, I'm coming out of this like with a more positive lens towards Final Fantasy 16 than I played it the first time, but I still have some issues with it. So now that I've told you, where I was before I played Final Fantasy 16 and then where I eventually am at this point, let me get into some specifics about the things I love about the game, the things I don't like, and some of those unforgettable moments that I talked about earlier. The first thing I gotta talk about, and I think this is really important because to me, when I think about what's most important to me in not just a Final Fantasy game, but specifically an RPG or a JRPG, it's gotta be the story. Now, other people might value something differently. Some people think like, it's a game. Gameplay needs to come first. That's fine. Everyone's gonna look for a different thing when it comes to game. For me, one of the top things I look for, I'm not saying I don't look for gameplay. Gameplay is incredibly important. But one of the top things I look for is story. And how did Final Fantasy 16 story? So how did Final Fantasy 16 story appeal to me? So for me, the storytelling for Final Fantasy 16 really peaks at the Bahamut arc. Anytime you transform to Ifrit, that's the end of an arc. that's the way I've always looked at it. I think they did so many good things in that intro for Final Fantasy 16. It was literally so good. The demo, the first 2 hours of the game, where I was like, oh my god, this might be one of the best Final Fantasies I've ever played. There's like a mix of like Attack on Titan. There's a mix of old Final Fantasy into it, but it's also taking itself really seriously and not afraid to be dark. I won't say anything is too dark in this game, but I will say there's not enough moments of levity, and that's my issue with the tone of the game. But overall, the storytelling is very, very compelling in the very beginning. When there's a mystery behind a lot of the stuff, that's when I feel like this game really shines and really succeeds. You find out there's so many mysteries that slowly get unfolded. Who Garuda is, who she works for. There's stuff around Sid that you don't quite know. There's stuff around Clive that you're still figuring out. You're figuring out who the big bad villain is. All those things and the way they build up to it, excellent. And that's the best part of the story. I think my problem with the story is when some of those things are revealed. Some of the times they're revealed really well, and honestly, when I just look at the story content, I don't really have an issue with the story content and maybe the lore of the world, but I do have an issue with the storytelling. There's so many little filler arcs that just don't need to be there, especially after the Bahamut fight. The amount of side quests that just feel like, okay, now these side quests are becoming important, but like it's like also like the amount of other side quests I had to do for these side quests to be important or mean something to me. It wasn't everything I wanted personally, but it's also not my story to tell. I'm just experiencing the story and I'm just telling people how they like it. Some people love the ending and they think it's perfect and it's one of the best endings in Final Fantasy. For me, there's some aspects of the ending I don't like, and again, I think that really goes down to this way the story is told, and I want to make a video about that in the future because I need to go into detail about this. But for this quick discussion, the ending is beautiful in its own way. even though it's not everything I wanted, I can acknowledge that it's a great ending to what they were trying to accomplish with this game. So let's move on to characters, right? Clive Rossfield, in the very beginning of the game, especially when it got towards the middle of the game, was actually one of my favorite protagonists in the series. After the Bahamut arc, that goes down a few notches. And that mainly comes down to the Clive I thought I knew in the beginning of the game was not the Clive I thought I was getting at the end of the game, if that makes sense. There was less, and then I felt like the conversations he was having with a lot of the main villains and everything were just so repetitive, especially when it comes to like the free will conversation he would have with Ultima and Barnabas's henchman that I forgot the name of. There's a lot of deep stuff that you could do with that. And there's other games like I know Xenogears is a game that really takes advantage of that concept of free will and no free will and stuff like that. Like, who are we really beings that do have free will? Like, and they go into like some stuff that I think that's really great about it. That game has problems, but that discussion in that game was handled very well. Where in this, you know, they were starting this concept of free will, no free will, but like it never really went anywhere. It was just like having the same conversation over and over. And I didn't like that. And then because Clive's story eventually went in that direction, I started to like him less as a character in a weird way, because I was like, well, this is the only thing we're talking about. I'm not learning anything more about you. You're not being challenged in any way. You're actually kind of a dick to some of the people that you were protecting in the beginning of the game, and you're making some choices that I feel like put other people in harm's way. So he kind of went down a few notches, but the sacrifice he makes at the end kind of makes up for a lot of it. The relationship he had with Joshua, who I'll talk about next, was very, very touching to me. And so, you know, and the way that he did sacrifice himself for the people that he loved and for the world that almost kind of like didn't treat him well in the first place, but he believed that there was still enough good that he saw in the world to give the world a second chance without magic. And he just said like, hey, you know, almost it was, I think that his last thing around that he tells Ultima around like, hey, like, you know, humans, they don't always make the best decisions. We're probably gonna fuck up a lot after having this free will, but that's going to be our choices, and we're going to learn from that, and we fight and we protect each other at the end of the day when things get tough. And I like that message that he has at the end of the game, and I felt like that was very touching. So I'm going to give it a chance. I'm going to say Clive is like a good protagonist. He has a lot of flaws, and not like good flaws where it's like, oh, like Zidane in Final Fantasy IX, he steals things, or he's like, you know, a little bit of a like overconfident person where like those flaws are things that he learns from later on. Clive he's smart, very caring in the beginning, and for some reason he's dumb in this somewhat, and then he becomes very caring again towards the end. And there's this middle portion of the story that I feel like doesn't treat him to the best of his ability, but otherwise he's a great main character. When I think about the side characters that I love, right, I ultimately think of two. And one of them is Joshua. Now, Joshua is interesting because you get to play as Joshua in the very beginning of the game. And I feel like he has a very unique perspective, being someone that's born to be the king of his kingdom, even though he doesn't feel like he deserves the right to be. But, you know, there's so much depth within his character and how he feels about himself and his brother, and how he takes on this responsibility, even though he honestly doesn't want this responsibility of being the phoenix and being the king of the land, but because he wants to respect his father, and because he looks up to his brother, and his brother did so much to sacrifice for his cause, for him to prove that he can be a good shield to his brother. He's like, you know what, my brother's doing all this stuff for me. I don't want to do this, but if my brother's doing this for me, I'm going to make sure that I'm going to do the best of my ability to do the best work I can. You know, like I'm in this position, I'm gonna deal with it. And that's something I really loved about Joshua. And I loved how smart he was. I liked how cunning he was. There's a few things story-wise where I feel like there's some flaws with him, but he's a kind of character where the character flaws add to his character, right? No character should be perfect. And I think Joshua's flaws really, when it comes to like maybe being maybe overconfident at times, and at times, you know, putting others above himself, but like almost to a fault where like, dude, you cannot take care of your friends and everybody else if you yourself are dying, like literally dying. Joshua, I love. Joshua, I really like as a character, and I feel like he did a lot of. I don't think he's perfect, but I like him a lot. I can't forget about this list without mentioning Dion. Dion is an excellent character. The only flaw is that he doesn't get a lot of screen time until his arc, in the Bahamut arc. The reason why I like Joshua a little bit more is just because I get to see him as a person from the beginning of the game, so I have more time with him, which is not fair to Dion. But Dion, if I had to just rate the characters on coolness, Dion would be it. Dion is the coolest character in the game. He has one of the best arcs, being this dragoon knight that is always for his people, but then this tragedy happens to him where he's in a situation where he just kind of like loses everything, based on the circumstances of this otherworldly being that Joshua tries to warn him about. He's like, I have to focus on my people first. And because he focuses on his country and his people first, that almost in a weird way leads to the downfall of his country, because he doesn't see the bigger threat, the larger picture. And then he starts to blame himself, and then he has this whole redemption arc where he's like, the only way out for me is death, after like betraying my people the way I did. And then he has this moment, if you do one of the good side quests, one of the very few good side quests, where he has this really beautiful redemption arc, right, where he actually talks to Hippocrates, who's one of the side characters in the story, and you learn so much about those two, and I feel like it adds so much to that character. And then he kind of comes out of that conversation not saying like, oh, like, he didn't come out of it like saying like, oh, you know what, I actually want to live now. Like, he was still very much like, I still don't know if I want to live or not. But he began to question like, maybe there is a life outside of death for me. I almost forgot to talk about Sid. How crazy. Really quick, going back to characters I like, Sid is also a character I like very much so. If I were to rank my favorite characters in order, it would be Joshua, Dion, Sid, and then Torgal. Sid was amazing. My biggest flaw, my biggest con about this is that he dies way too soon. He should have died later. I get it that they were trying to do this whole like Clive took his legacy thing. That still should have happened later. When he died, a lot of the fun of the game went away. He was like the fun part of the game for me. He was very much a character of hope. He very much added a lot of levity that just was not there after he left. After that, it was just dire and dark. And this is what I mean. Like they needed a character like Sid that had a lot of wisdom, but was also very charismatic. When they lost Sid, like a third into the game, a lot of that went away. And I think he carried a lot of that game up until that point. When I think about the villains, right? Like I think about Benedicta. All right. Like she's okay. She's not bad. I like her more than Titan. I like the fight between Titan and Clive more, but as a character, I felt like Benedicta had more depth. And then also, Barnabas, honestly, one of the worst fucking villains in Final Fantasy. I'm sorry. He's cool as Odin, I guess. His powers are cool. It's cool that he splits the sea. His abilities are cool. I'm not fucking doubting that. He's a strong fighter, but he literally, you have to learn about him through the ATLs, which is a system where you look into the game's story through like reading up on stuff. You learn about him that way, but I need to see that thing. I can't just read up on his shit and just like expect to have some sort of emotion towards it. It's just not going to work that way. So Barnabas was a really disappointing character for me. Ultima also, honestly, I like the idea of Ultima as a lore villain. Like he's very similar to like Necron from Final Fantasy IX, sorry. In the sense that he's like not there as much in the beginning, but he becomes more of a presence as a final boss for the series. But still, I like the idea of Ultima, but I just wish that there was a more involved discussion between him and Clive. Like maybe try to convince Clive that taking over his body was a good idea, instead of just saying like, no, I'm gonna do it. I'm just gonna take over your body. It would have been more insightful, impactful if he was like, look, Clive, if I take your body, this is the paradise that we can have. This is what I plan to do with the future. I plan to have a world of like, make a compelling argument. Please. I need, the story's only as good as its villain. And Ultima like is presented as like this god with like no emotion, and that's fine, and only using logic. They could have done more with that. They could have been better conversations with him, Barnabas, Clive, showing him the paradise that like maybe Ultima promised Barnabas, I guess. The stuff that I had to see Sephiroth go through. I don't think Sephiroth's the best villain in the series, honestly. Yana just comes and goes, but I like the way they at least explain his backstory and everything. I think that was done very well. The whole Nibelheim thing, Final Fantasy 9, everything with Kuja was done great. Even Final Fantasy 15, right? Like, I don't think everything about that game is great, but the villain is so strong in that game. And I just don't think Ultima is as strong as a villain. I just think he's a very poor villain. In terms of the characters, you know, I have some favorites. They tend to be the side characters. The main characters, unfortunately, not always that interesting, but I still like a lot of them. I don't like any of the villains though. That's the biggest downside for this game for me, is that I just didn't like the villains. Barnabas, Benedicta, Titan. The fights were cool with them. I think Benedicta, ironically, her being the first one to die, was the strongest up to that point, and even her I don't think was that strong of a villain. Now, I gotta end this with music and I guess visuals, right? In terms of the visuals of this game, you know, there's a lot of spectacle in a lot of things, and I will get to, maybe I'll spend the last 2 minutes talking about some of the almost unforgettable moments in this game for me. But the visuals in this game are stunning. I'm not going to even deny that. It's a very, very beautiful, well-polished game. Some of the cutscenes are just out of this world crazy. Even like the in-game cutscenes, like they are a little bit wooden and weird sometimes, but you know, nothing outside of the ordinary. Like Baldur's Gate is a great game and it has similar looking cutscenes, not as detailed in terms of like polygons or whatever the fuck like people talk about when they talk about game and graphics nowadays, but it's still really like it's stilted, it's a little bit wooden and stuff, but like it's still good. Like it's still very, very good. I think the graphics are stunning and there's no doubt about it. It's on PS5 and I expect it to be, but to be honest with you, as I get older, graphics mean less and less to me over time. I have a more fun time looking at different art styles as I get older, not just realistic settings. But let me talk about the music. The music in this game is, you know, like if I think about every Icon fight, it has some of the best music in the series. Soken is an amazing composer, and I'm never going to take that away from him. He has some of the best vocal themes in the series. He pays so much great homage to Nobuo Uematsu when he plays when he does his own arrangements of the Final Fantasy theme or the Prelude theme. Like just so many little things. The Chocobo theme, right? The Moogle theme, whatever. Like all those big themes, he does it in his own way, but it still feels like Final Fantasy. And I think the most Final Fantasy thing about this game is the music. The music is just breathtaking. My favorite boss themes are, you know, like Away. I like, is it called Gravity? It's the Garuda fight one. I believe it's called Gravity. If I'm wrong, I'll correct myself over here, but Away is obviously a favorite. I like Ascension quite a bit, even though it's not my favorite. The Titan fight, not my taste in music, but for his character, fuck it, it works. And there's a lot of all the boss fights are great too. The music in this game, you just gotta listen to it. I've been playing throughout this video some of the music in this game, and it's a ride from beginning to end. I really like the music in Final Fantasy 16, and in fact, I think, you know, as impressive as the visuals is, I was expecting the visuals to be that good. It's great in every Final Fantasy except the original 7 before its time. That was good, I guess. But music blew me out of the water. Even some of the, I will say the things I didn't like musically was maybe some of the, like the town themes were good actually, but like the overworld themes, I didn't love all of them, except there's one in particular that I love, and it's particularly in a forest area. I forgot the name of it. Would I put in my top 5 soundtracks? That's really fucking hard. I don't think I would, to be honest with you. But all the Final Fantasy soundtracks, even from the games I like, every single Final Fantasy soundtrack is like at the worst. The worst mainline Final Fantasy soundtrack is amazing. Like it's like they're all good in their own way. It's so strange. And I think when people talk about this game, they're gonna really look at those Icon fights as kind of like, oh well, like this is the best part of the game, and it kind of is. What I think about Final Fantasy 16 is that it's a very, very flawed masterpiece. While I like the game, I don't think it's a top 5 Final Fantasy for me. What I look for in a Final Fantasy game is hard to tell now, and it's been hard since 10. And I don't think it's the nostalgia talking, because I didn't play some of these games until I got older. In fact, I didn't beat Final Fantasy X until like 5 years ago, right? I'm 28 now. It's only been 5 years, and I still view Final Fantasy X as my second favorite Final Fantasy. And I think it's just that when I go back and I look at those era of games, there was just something really special about that particular team and what they are able to accomplish with every iteration of the game. There's a reason why there's a lot of people that don't view this as a Final Fantasy. I do. I think it's good enough to be a Final Fantasy game, but I don't think it's good enough to be the best Final Fantasy game, or even in the conversation for top 5. Everyone has their own opinion, and I know a lot of people that share that opinion, that to them it is their favorite or it's in their top 5. It wasn't that way for me, unfortunately, but I still had an amazing experience at points, and I had a very disappointing experience at other points. But overall, is it a good game? Yeah, Final Fantasy XVI, it's a good game.